"Get out of here! This is not your seat!" The words sliced through the quiet hum of the first-class cabin like a blade. The passengers, all dressed in expensive attire, glanced up in shock, their eyes scanning the woman who had just been humiliated. Cheryl, the calm and composed black CEO of a multinational company, sat with her infant, dressed in simple yet elegant clothing, radiating power without the need for a designer logo. She had just boarded this flight like any other business trip, expecting nothing more than a smooth ride to her next meeting. But today, her journey would be anything but ordinary. The flight attendant, a middle-aged white woman with a stern look, had decided that Cheryl didn't belong. Without checking her ticket, she arrogantly dismissed her, assuming that Cheryl, dressed in understated clothes, was just another imposter who had somehow snuck into the luxurious first-class section. "I said get out of here now!" The tension in the cabin was palpable, and every eye turned toward Cheryl, watching her every move. The woman was being kicked out of her seat in front of everyone, all because of the color of her skin. But what they didn't know was that Cheryl wasn't the type to back down. She wasn't just any regular passenger, she owned part of the airline. And in a moment, everything would change. "Check my husband's name," Cheryl spoke calmly but with authority, her voice cutting through the growing tension. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her now, and a murmur spread across the cabin. The flight attendants hesitated, unsure of what to do next. But Cheryl wasn't about to let this slide. As the stewardess continued to argue, Cheryl calmly pulled out her phone and dialed her assistant. "Activate Protocol 6, she said coldly, as if she were giving a simple command to a well-trained employee. Little did they know this was no ordinary woman. The passengers exchanged nervous glances. Some began filming the incident, while others whispered among themselves. Cheryl's eyes locked with the flight attendant, who was now visibly shaken by the realization that she had misjudged her. "You've made a terrible mistake," Cheryl added, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with an undeniable sense of power. The flight attendant, realizing her error, fumbled with the intercom, but it was already too late. Cheryl had already set the wheels in motion. Moments later, the airline's corporate legal team would be on the line, and by the time the plane landed, the entire crew would be out of a job. They had no idea who they were dealing with. What would happen next? The flight, once calm and serene, was now charged with the tension of the unfolding drama. Cheryl didn't need to yell or make a scene. She knew exactly how to handle this, and soon the crew would learn just how powerful a woman can be when pushed too far. Stay tuned for the shocking twist you won't see coming. The tension in the first-class cabin was so thick, you could feel it in the air. Cheryl remained seated, the eyes of the passengers now fixed on her. She held her infant in her arms, her calm demeanor contrasting with the chaos around her. The flight attendant, who had been so sure of herself, stood frozen. She had just made a mistake, and now she had no idea how to fix it. She had assumed Cheryl was nothing more than a regular passenger, someone who didn't belong in the luxurious first-class section. But Cheryl had been sitting in this section for a reason, because she owned a part of the airline. The stewardess, however, had let her prejudice blind her to the truth. The passengers around her were starting to murmur, some recording the interaction, others whispering among themselves. No one knew exactly what was happening, but one thing was clear. They had all witnessed an injustice unfold before their eyes. Cheryl, however, wasn't fazed. She wasn't the type to let an insult slide, especially when it came to matters of dignity and respect. Her eyes never left the flight attendant as she calmly reached into her bag and dialed her assistant. "Activate Protocol 6, Cheryl said, her voice steady, barely a whisper, but with enough authority to send a chill through the air. Her assistant, Carla, immediately began to execute the plan that had been in place for years, a plan for handling any situation that involved blatant discrimination. While the flight attendant stood there, unsure of what to do next, Cheryl's assistant was already working behind the scenes, contacting the legal team, the airline's higher-ups, and even the media. Cheryl knew this wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, unseen, or insignificant because of the color of their skin. As the flight attendant continued to fumble, Cheryl sat back, her posture straight and unwavering, a picture of control and power. She had seen this before, the looks, the assumptions, the prejudice, but she wasn't the same woman she had been years ago when she first encountered these types of obstacles. Now, she had the resources, the knowledge, and the power to turn the tables. The other passengers were starting to take notice, some of them now standing up and taking out their phones to document the incident. One woman, sitting by the window, leaned over and whispered, "I've seen this happen before. It's wrong." Another passenger, a man in a suit, nodded, his face filled with disbelief. How was this happening in first class? Cheryl could feel the weight of their stares, but it didn't faze her. This wasn't just about her. This was about standing up to systemic inequality, to the daily microaggressions that so many people of color faced but had no platform to fight back against. As she sat there, her phone buzzing with updates from her assistant, Cheryl made a decision. This was no longer about a seat on a plane. This was about sending a message. The message was clear. No one, not even those who believed they were untouchable, could get away with such blatant discrimination. The flight attendants, still unsure of what to do next, began to look at each other nervously. The captain, who had been alerted to the situation, stepped into the cabin, his face stoic. He walked over to Cheryl and addressed her directly. "Ma'am, we've received a complaint, and we need you to vacate your seat." Cheryl raised an eyebrow. "A complaint?" she asked, her voice calm yet piercing. "From who?" The captain, realizing the gravity of his words, paused. He wasn't prepared for this. Cheryl wasn't some random passenger. She wasn't someone to be dismissed or ignored. "We can resolve this without further disruption," the captain said, trying to regain control of the situation, but Cheryl wasn't buying it. "You don't get to tell me what to do," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "You don't get to tell me how to move, how to sit, how to exist in this space. I own this space." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The captain, taken aback, glanced at the flight attendants who were now visibly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand," the captain began, but Cheryl cut him off. "No, I understand perfectly. You're the ones who don't understand." She turned her head, her gaze locking onto the flight attendant who had made the initial accusation. "You called me a fraud. You asked me to leave a place I belong," Cheryl continued. "And now you'll learn exactly what happens when you underestimate a black woman." The captain, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, took a step back. He knew this wasn't a simple case of a misunderstanding. This was bigger than that, and Cheryl wasn't going to let it slide. As the passengers watched in stunned silence, Cheryl's assistant continued to work behind the scenes. The legal team was already drafting statements, and the media was being alerted. Cheryl's message was clear. She would not be dismissed. She would not be ignored. And no one, no matter their position, was immune from facing the consequences of their actions. The flight attendants, realizing the enormity of their mistake, began to retreat. The captain, too, seemed to be reconsidering his approach. Cheryl had made her point. And as the plane continued its journey, Cheryl sat back, her posture unwavering, knowing that this moment, this act of defiance, would have ripple effects far beyond the confines of this plane. She had just taken her first step toward changing the system, one that had underestimated her for far too long. The cabin was now a battleground, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the engines above and the nervous rustling of passengers who had begun to realize the gravity of the situation. Cheryl, calm as ever, sat with her baby, her eyes focused ahead as if nothing were amiss. The flight attendants and captain stood, unsure of how to proceed, their previous confidence shattered by the magnitude of the moment. Cheryl was no longer just a passenger. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the air around her seemed to pulse with the weight of it. The passengers, once passive observers, now began to murmur among themselves. Some were already on their phones, quietly documenting the unfolding drama, while others looked nervously at the flight crew, unsure of how things would play out. The power dynamics had shifted. The stewardess who had first confronted Cheryl, now standing at a distance, couldn't seem to meet her eyes. Cheryl's voice, steady and unyielding, cut through the tension like a blade. "You've humiliated me in front of everyone," she said, her gaze never wavering. "You've made assumptions about me based on how I look, and now you're going to pay for it." The captain shifted uncomfortably, his face pale, but he still maintained his authority. He wasn't used to this. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset," he began, his voice weak and uncertain. "But this is a matter of protocol." Cheryl's eyes snapped to his, sharp and direct. "Protocol? You mean the protocol that discriminates against people like me? The protocol that assumes I don't belong here because of the color of my skin? The captain hesitated. He had no answer, because Cheryl was right. The real protocol at play was one that allowed for people like her to be treated as if they didn't matter, as if they weren't entitled to the same respect as anyone else. You don't belong here, the words echoed through the cabin, a harsh reminder of the prejudice Cheryl had faced her whole life. But now, those words would no longer hold power. You think I don't belong? Cheryl's voice rose, not in anger but in quiet defiance. Then ask yourself, why do you? The room grew even quieter, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The flight attendants looked at each other, but no one spoke. Cheryl's words had done what they hadn't expected. They had shaken the very foundation of the power they had taken for granted. And now, it was clear, Cheryl wasn't going anywhere. You've made a mistake, Cheryl said softly but with finality, and now you're going to fix it. The captain, now visibly uncomfortable, took a step back. He had no idea how to handle this situation. Cheryl wasn't just another passenger to be dismissed. She was the one who held the power in this situation. The flight crew had no idea what to do. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, Cheryl's assistant Carla called again, her voice crisp and clear through the phone. Protocol 6 is live. We're handling it from here. Cheryl hung up and looked directly at the flight attendant who had caused the disruption. You're not going to get away with this, Cheryl said, her voice colder now. You're going to pay for this, and it's not going to be pretty. The flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, realizing that this wasn't just about a seat or a flight anymore. Cheryl had just triggered a chain of events that would lead to consequences no one on this plane could have predicted. It wasn't just about one woman being humiliated anymore. This was about power, justice, and equality. The stewardess, realizing the depth of her mistake, took a step back. Her previously confident posture collapsed under the weight of the situation. The passengers, some still filming, others watching in disbelief, began to shift in their seats, their attention fixed on Cheryl. She was the one in control now. Cheryl sat back, calm and composed, knowing she had made her point. The flight crew had underestimated her, assumed she was just another woman of color who could be dismissed, silenced. But now, they were learning what happens when you mistake silence for submission. The flight attendants and captain, once sure of themselves, were now stumbling over their words, looking at Cheryl with a mix of fear and uncertainty. Cheryl had turned the tables, and there was no going back now. She had the power. And soon the whole world would know just how far she was willing to go to make sure no one else ever faced the same treatment she had just endured. This was just the beginning. The passengers could feel it. They could feel the change in the air. The flight crew could feel it too. And as Cheryl sat there, poised and unshaken, she knew that the ripple effect of this moment would be felt far beyond the confines of this plane. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the embodiment of resistance. And the flight crew? They were about to learn the hard way what happens when you underestimate a black woman who refuses to be silenced. The tension inside the cabin had reached its breaking point. The flight attendants, now realizing the gravity of their actions, stood frozen, unsure of how to move forward. Cheryl, still calm and collected, continued to sit in her seat, her baby peacefully in her arms, a stark contrast to the chaos surrounding her. It was as if she was the eye of a storm, centered in a room filled with uncertainty and fear. The captain, visibly rattled, walked toward Cheryl with hesitation. His face, usually stern and composed, now showed signs of doubt and unease. "Ma'am," he began, his voice shaky, "I need you to understand that this situation is escalating. We cannot have disruptions on board, especially in first class." Cheryl raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanged. "Disruptions?" she repeated calmly. "You think I'm the disruption? Or do you think it's your treatment of me that has caused the disruption?" The captain faltered. He had no answer. Cheryl's words had cut deeper than any reprimand or warning ever could. For the first time, the captain was on the defensive. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you to leave the flight," he said, trying to regain control. But his words sounded hollow, powerless. Cheryl shook her head, her eyes never leaving his. "You're going to ask me to leave? Or are you going to ask yourself why I, someone who belongs here, am being treated like this? You don't get to dictate who stays and who goes." Not anymore. The other passengers, who had been sitting in stunned silence, began to murmur, exchanging glances. They had been watching the scene unfold, and now they were starting to realize the true nature of what was happening. Some passengers who had been reluctant to get involved were starting to speak up. "She's right," a man in the back row said, his voice firm. "You've already made a mistake. Don't make it worse." More voices joined in, with passengers nodding in agreement. It was clear that the power dynamic had shifted. The flight attendants, who had once held all the authority, were now second-guessing their every move. Cheryl didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to shout or make a scene. Her presence, her calm and unwavering demeanor, was enough to shift the entire atmosphere of the cabin. She wasn't just a passenger, she was a force to be reckoned with. The flight attendants, now visibly uncomfortable, exchanged nervous glances. They knew they couldn't win this battle. They had misjudged Cheryl, underestimated her, and now they were paying the price. "I'm not going anywhere," Cheryl said softly, her voice steady and strong. She turned her gaze back to the captain. "And neither are you, not if you don't make this right." The captain's face reddened as he realized the depth of his mistake. He had underestimated Cheryl because of her appearance. He had assumed she was just another person to be dismissed, ignored, treated as less than. But now he saw the truth. Cheryl was not someone to be dismissed. She was someone who commanded respect, who commanded attention, and most importantly, who commanded justice. Cheryl's assistant, Carla, was now on the line, her voice clear and direct. "The legal team is already on it," she said. "We've alerted corporate. We've already begun compiling the statements, and we'll be making sure this situation is handled swiftly." Cheryl nodded, her calm confidence never wavering. "Thank you, Carla," she said softly, then turned back to the captain. "You've made your mistake. Now you'll learn what it means to be accountable." The passengers were watching, many of them now standing in solidarity with Cheryl. Some had begun to record the incident, while others simply stared, unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was clear. This was no longer about a simple case of a passenger being denied a seat. This was about standing up against discrimination, against the systemic oppression that so many people of color faced daily. This was about making sure that no one, regardless of their appearance, was ever made to feel like they didn't belong. The flight crew stood silently, unsure of what to do next. They had no power left in this situation. The passengers, Cheryl, and her assistant, Carla, had taken that power away. They were now merely spectators in a scene they never thought would unfold in the midst of a routine flight. Cheryl had turned the tables. She had made sure that the injustice would not go unchallenged, and now the consequences were coming. The captain, his face still flushed with embarrassment, glanced at the flight attendants and nodded. "We'll get this sorted," he said weakly. Cheryl didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than any words could have been. As the captain walked away, Cheryl turned her gaze back to the window, the sunlight streaming in, casting a soft glow across her face. She had won. And in that moment, the entire cabin felt the weight of the victory. The battle had been fought, and Cheryl had emerged victorious, not by force, but by her unwavering belief in herself and the righteousness of her cause. The power dynamics had shifted, and there was no going back. Cheryl wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She was a symbol of resistance, of the fight for justice, and of the unwavering strength that comes from knowing your worth. The tension in the cabin was now almost unbearable, a heavy silence hanging in the air as the flight attendants and the captain retreated to the back of the plane. Cheryl remained seated, her composure unwavering. Her eyes, still locked on the view outside the window, revealed nothing of the storm that had just passed through the cabin. The passengers around her, once mere observers, were now on edge, unsure of what would happen next. They had all witnessed something remarkable, something that would change the way they viewed authority and power. They had seen a woman, black, calm, and determined, stand up to an entire system of discrimination and win. As the plane continued its journey through the skies, the ripple effect of Cheryl's actions spread. Whispers circulated throughout the cabin, some passengers still unsure of the full extent of the situation. Others, however, were already making connections, already starting to realize the significance of what had just occurred. They weren't just witnessing an altercation between a passenger and flight attendants. They were witnessing a moment in history, a moment where a black woman had stood up and demanded respect, and that respect had been given. The captain, meanwhile, was on the phone with the airline's corporate office, his voice low and strained as he explained the situation. He was being questioned, of course, but there was no way out of it. Cheryl had won. She had set a chain of events in motion that couldn't be stopped. The flight attendants, too, were quietly reporting back, their hands trembling slightly as they made their way to their respective stations. They knew they had made a mistake, and they knew there would be consequences. But the question remained, how far would the consequences reach? Cheryl's assistant, Carla, was already preparing for the next steps. The legal team was on standby, ready to take action as soon as the plane landed. The media had been alerted, and Cheryl's team was already working behind the scenes to ensure that the airline would be held accountable for their actions. But Cheryl was not in a rush. She knew that this was only the beginning. Her goal was not just to take down a few flight attendants or a captain who had made a mistake. Her goal was to make a statement, to show the world that when you stand up to injustice, you can win. And win she had. The flight attendants who had once wielded power now walked around the cabin with their heads down, their once confident postures now deflated. They had been humbled in the face of Cheryl's strength. The captain, too, had lost his sense of control. He was no longer the one who called the shots, and he knew it. As the plane neared its destination, the mood in the cabin had shifted. It was no longer a place of tension or fear, but of solidarity. The passengers, many of whom had been passive witnesses just an hour ago, now stood with Cheryl, some even applauding her quietly. They knew what had happened was right, and they were proud to have witnessed it. Cheryl, however, remained calm as always. She was no longer concerned with the flight attendants or the captain. Her thoughts were already on what would happen once the plane landed. She was ready for the next step. The moment the plane touched down, Cheryl's team would go to work, and the airline would feel the full weight of the consequences of their actions. But Cheryl wasn't just concerned with their punishment. She wanted to make sure that no one else would ever have to endure the kind of treatment she had just experienced. The airline, the flight attendants, and the captain would all pay for what had happened. But Cheryl knew that true change would come when the system itself was held accountable. As the plane taxied to the gate, Cheryl stood up, her baby in her arms, her posture as straight as it had been when she had first boarded. She was not just a passenger anymore. She was a leader, a symbol of resistance. The passengers, who had once been hesitant, now looked to her with admiration. Cheryl, without saying a word, turned and walked down the aisle, her steps purposeful, her presence commanding. As she exited the plane, the weight of what she had done hung in the air, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The flight attendants, still standing by their stations, could only watch as Cheryl walked away. They knew that they had just witnessed something transformative, and in that moment, they realized something that would stay with them forever. Cheryl was not just a woman who had been wronged, she was a woman who had fought back, and in doing so, she had changed everything. As Cheryl exited the plane, her every step seemed to echo in the minds of everyone still seated, like a silent anthem of resistance. She didn't look back, not at the crew who had underestimated her, not at the passengers who had witnessed it all. She knew the battle had just begun, but she had already claimed her victory. The airline, the captain, and the flight attendants would soon feel the consequences of their actions. But for now, Cheryl was focused on what mattered most, changing the system, ensuring no one else would face what she had just endured. The moment she stepped off the plane, her assistant Carla was already there, waiting with her phone in hand, her face determined. "It's all in motion," Carla said quietly, walking beside Cheryl as they made their way toward the terminal. "Corporate's on the line, legal's moving. We've already reached out to the media." "It's happening," Cheryl nodded, her eyes scanning the busy airport around her. "Good. But it's not enough just to punish them. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. We need to make sure everyone knows this story, so it becomes a turning point." She paused, taking a deep breath, then turned to Carla. "We need to take the fight to them. Hard." As Cheryl walked through the airport, she felt the weight of what she was about to do. This was bigger than one flight, bigger than just her. This was about making sure that the world knew that discrimination, no matter how subtle or blatant, would not be tolerated. She was going to make sure of it. As they exited the airport, a black SUV pulled up, the driver opening the door for them. Cheryl slid into the back seat, her thoughts already on the next steps. She knew that the power she wielded now was immense, but she also knew that the real work was just beginning. Back at the airline's headquarters, executives were already scrambling. They had received countless calls, emails, and social media posts, all demanding accountability for what had happened on Flight 784. The public was angry. The media had picked up on the story quickly, and now it was everywhere. Cheryl's name was trending, not because she wanted fame or attention, but because she had stood up and fought for what was right. The media outlets had already begun to cover the incident, with many passengers sharing their stories on social media. Some applauded Cheryl for her bravery, while others questioned the airline's handling of the situation. The message was clear: this was not something that could be swept under the rug. As Cheryl's team coordinated with the media, they began to release statements, providing evidence of what had happened on the flight. They made sure that every detail, every piece of the story, was shared with the world. The airline's corporate offices were now in full crisis mode. Executives were meeting behind closed doors, trying to figure out how to handle the fallout from the incident. But Cheryl wasn't interested in waiting for them to make their next move. She was going to take control of the narrative, to ensure that the story was told the way it needed to be told. She wasn't going to let them rewrite the truth. The next day, Cheryl held a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, all eager to hear her side of the story. She walked in, her presence commanding the room as she took her seat at the podium. The reporters' questions came fast and furious, but Cheryl answered each one with calm confidence. She wasn't just talking about what had happened on the plane, she was talking about the bigger picture. "This isn't just about me," Cheryl said, her voice strong and clear. "This is about every person who has ever been made to feel small, insignificant, or invisible because of their race, their gender, or any other factor. This is about making sure that we live in a world where no one, no matter their background, is treated like they don't belong." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "I refuse to be silent. I refuse to allow this behavior to go unchallenged. And I will fight for justice, not just for me, but for all of us." The room fell silent as the weight of her words landed on the reporters and the audience. Cheryl had just delivered the message loud and clear. The fight for equality was far from over, and she was going to lead the charge. The media outlets began to pick up on her message, amplifying her words. The public, too, was responding. Social media was flooded with support for Cheryl, and many people began to share their own stories of discrimination and injustice. It was clear. Cheryl was no longer just a CEO. She was a symbol of resistance, a symbol of strength, and a symbol of the fight for justice. Back at the airline, the executives were starting to realize the magnitude of what they had done. The pressure was mounting, and the consequences of their actions were beginning to take shape. Cheryl had taken control of the narrative, and now the world was watching. As the media continued to cover the story, it became clear that the airline's reputation was on the line. And the more they tried to avoid the truth, the more they dug themselves into a hole. Cheryl wasn't done yet. She knew that the next step was to make sure the airline felt the full weight of their actions. It wasn't just about them apologizing or giving a few people their jobs back. This was about accountability, about making sure that systemic injustice was confronted head-on. The battle for justice had only just begun, and Cheryl was ready to take it as far as it needed to go. As she sat back in her office, reviewing the media coverage, she allowed herself a small smile. She had started a movement, and she wasn't going to stop until the world saw change. As the days passed, the media frenzy surrounding Cheryl's bold actions showed no signs of slowing down. What had begun as a single incident on a plane had grown into a global conversation about power, race, and equality. Every major news outlet covered the story, and Cheryl's name was now synonymous with justice and resistance. She had become a symbol of strength, not just for Black people, but for anyone who had ever been oppressed or made to feel small. The support for Cheryl continued to pour in from all corners of the world. Social media was flooded with messages of solidarity. Hashtags like #Justice for Cheryl and #Equality for All were trending, and countless individuals shared their own stories of discrimination, many expressing their gratitude for Cheryl's bravery. People saw in Cheryl what they wished they could be: someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, the airline was in full crisis management mode, but no matter how hard they tried, the damage had already been done. They issued an official statement, apologizing for the incident, but it was clear that their words were hollow. The public wasn't buying it. They had seen the way Cheryl had been treated, and they weren't willing to accept a simple apology as enough. The airline's stock took a hit as investors grew nervous about the public backlash. The company's reputation, once considered untouchable, was now in question. Executives scrambled to find a way out, but Cheryl had already set the stage. She wasn't just waiting for an apology, she was demanding accountability. Behind the scenes, Cheryl's legal team was hard at work. They were preparing a lawsuit against the airline, not just for the discrimination she had faced, but for the systemic bias that was still deeply embedded in the company's practices. Cheryl had made it clear that she would not rest until every single person involved in the incident, from the flight attendants to the captain, was held accountable. But she wasn't stopping there. She wanted to ensure that this type of behavior would never happen again. Cheryl's team began working with lawmakers and civil rights organizations to advocate for stronger regulations against racial discrimination in the airline industry. She used her platform to push for change, speaking out at press conferences and interviews, demanding that the airline industry be held to higher standards. It wasn't just about her story anymore. It was about changing the system for good. She knew that her actions would have far-reaching consequences, but she was willing to take that risk. As the pressure on the airline grew, Cheryl continued to move forward with her plans. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all the people who had ever been marginalized, dismissed, or mistreated. She wanted to make sure that no one would ever feel like they had to stay silent in the face of injustice. Cheryl wasn't just a black CEO anymore. She was a force of nature, a woman who had taken on an entire industry and emerged victorious. She had used the power of her voice and her platform to shine a light on an issue that had been ignored for far too long. And now, the world was listening. As Cheryl sat in her office, reviewing the latest news coverage, she knew that her work wasn't done. This fight was bigger than one airline, bigger than one flight. This was about systemic change. This was about making sure that the next time someone like her walked into a place they belonged, they wouldn't be treated like an outsider. Cheryl wasn't just breaking down barriers. She was building new ones. She was laying the groundwork for a future where people didn't have to fight for respect, where no one would ever have to feel like they didn't belong. And as she looked out the window, she felt a sense of peace. She had started a movement, and it wasn't going to stop. The change she had ignited was unstoppable. The world was ready for it, and Cheryl was ready to lead it. Weeks had passed since the incident on Flight 784, and yet the reverberations of that moment continued to echo through the media, the courts, and the corporate boardrooms. Cheryl's name was now synonymous with a movement, one that transcended industries and borders. What had begun as a single act of defiance against discrimination had sparked a fire that could not be extinguished. Cheryl had become more than just a symbol of resistance. She had become a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. The airline, on the other hand, found itself under a magnifying glass. Despite their best attempts to manage the fallout, it was clear that they had underestimated the power of Cheryl's voice. The public wasn't satisfied with apologies or corporate statements. They demanded action. Cheryl's legal team had filed a comprehensive lawsuit against the airline, not just for the discrimination she had faced, but for the systemic racial biases that had permeated the company's practices for years. The legal battle was fierce, but Cheryl had already won the moral high ground. Her every statement, every public appearance, reinforced the truth of her cause. She wasn't fighting just for justice for herself. She was fighting for an entire community that had been continuously overlooked and mistreated. In the courtroom, the defense team for the airline attempted to paint Cheryl as an overreaction, a woman who had allowed her emotions to take control and escalate a minor situation. But Cheryl wasn't about to let that narrative stand. She took the stand herself, her voice unwavering and powerful as she told her side of the story. "This isn't about a single incident," she said, her words cutting through the room like a knife. "This is about a system that has failed to acknowledge the humanity of people like me. This is about years of being dismissed, judged, and silenced simply because of my skin color." Her words left the courtroom in stunned silence. The defense could not argue with the truth of what she was saying. She wasn't just a victim of a single event, she was a symbol of a much larger issue that needed to be addressed. Meanwhile, the airline's stock continued to plummet, and their once sterling reputation was now in tatters. Investors were concerned, and their actions sent a clear message. The company's inability to address the crisis head-on was costing them. But for Cheryl, the damage to the airline was secondary. What mattered to her was making sure that this incident sparked real change. She knew that if her story could change one person's perspective, it could change the world, and that was exactly what was happening. The airline was forced to take a long, hard look at its policies and practices. Under immense public pressure, they agreed to an internal audit, which would examine every aspect of their operations, from hiring practices to customer service. Cheryl was not about to let them off easy, though. She knew that true change would only come if those responsible were held accountable. The pressure on the airline continued to mount, as more and more passengers came forward with their own stories of discrimination and mistreatment. Cheryl's legal team worked tirelessly to collect evidence, gathering testimonies from employees and former customers alike. The movement was gaining traction, and the voices of those who had been silenced for so long were finally being heard. The public's support for Cheryl was unwavering, and the airline, despite its efforts to recover, knew that they would never fully regain the trust of their customers. Cheryl, however, remained focused on the bigger picture. "This isn't just about the airline," she said in one of her many public interviews. "This is about changing the entire system. This is about making sure that no one, no matter their race, their background, or their appearance, is ever made to feel like they don't belong." She was relentless in her pursuit of justice, using every platform available to her to push for systemic change. Her efforts were paying off. The airline's legal team began to crack under the pressure. The company was forced to settle, agreeing to a multi-million-dollar compensation package for Cheryl, along with an extensive public apology. But Cheryl wasn't satisfied with the settlement alone. She demanded that the airline implement comprehensive diversity and inclusion programs, not just in their hiring practices, but throughout every level of the company. Cheryl's victory was more than just financial. It was a monumental step toward creating a more equitable future. As the legal battle came to a close, Cheryl took a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. She had achieved what many thought was impossible. But she knew that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a leader in the fight for equality, and she was determined to continue pushing for change, not just in the airline industry, but across every sector where discrimination still ran rampant. Cheryl knew that her work was far from finished. There was much more to be done, and she was ready for whatever came next. The journey she had started on that plane had led her to a place of power and influence, but she understood that true power was not about titles or accolades. It was about making a difference. And Cheryl had already begun to make that difference. She wasn't done yet, and the world was watching. As the days turned into weeks, Cheryl's movement continued to gain momentum, and the ripple effect of her actions reached further than she ever expected. The media coverage was relentless, but it wasn't just the headlines or the news segments that mattered to her. It was the conversations happening around the world, from boardrooms to living rooms. The narrative had shifted, and for once, the voices of those who had been marginalized were no longer being ignored. Cheryl's efforts had sparked a much-needed dialogue about discrimination, power, and accountability. Everywhere she went, people approached her, thanking her for her bravery and sharing their own stories of injustice. What had started as a personal battle had now become a global movement, one that was reshaping how people thought about race, equality, and the systems that perpetuated inequality. Cheryl was no longer just a businesswoman or a CEO. She was a symbol of resistance, a leader who had dared to stand up to an industry that had long been entrenched in bias. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but she was ready to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. Despite her success, Cheryl remained grounded. She never lost sight of the people who had supported her and the community she was fighting for. She continued to use her platform to elevate others, giving them the space to share their own stories, and she made sure to center their voices in every conversation she had. She spoke not just as an individual, but as a representative of a much larger group of people who had been ignored for too long. Cheryl knew that this battle for justice wasn't over. The progress she had made so far was just the beginning, and she was determined to push further. She had witnessed firsthand how quickly the system could shift when the right voices were amplified, and she knew that the work had to continue until every institution, every organization, and every industry was held accountable for its role in perpetuating inequality. With each passing day, Cheryl's influence grew. She was invited to speak at conferences, at universities, and on panels discussing race, justice, and reform. She was asked to advise on policy changes, and her voice was sought after in discussions about how to create more inclusive workplaces and industries. But Cheryl didn't let the spotlight distract her. She remained laser-focused on her mission, to create systemic change. She knew that, as powerful as her story was, true change would come from dismantling the structures that allowed discrimination to thrive in the first place. The airline had settled the lawsuit, and they had implemented new diversity and inclusion initiatives. But Cheryl knew that this wasn't enough. She pushed for further reform, for measurable outcomes, for accountability at every level. She wasn't content with superficial gestures. She demanded that real, lasting change be made, that the systems that had failed so many for so long be completely overhauled. Her work didn't stop with the airline industry, though. Cheryl began to focus on larger societal issues, from education to criminal justice reform. She knew that no matter how much progress was made in one area, there were always more battles to fight, and she was ready for them. Cheryl's story was being taught in classrooms and discussed in boardrooms, but she didn't want to be remembered just for one incident. She wanted to be remembered for the change she had sparked, for the movement she had created, and for the future she was helping to build. She continued to be a fierce advocate for those who had no voice, and her tireless efforts to ensure that the systems that had kept people in the margins were dismantled were paying off. The world was beginning to see what Cheryl had always known. When you fight for justice, when you stand up for what's right, you can change the world. Cheryl wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a better future for everyone. The momentum behind her movement was unstoppable. People from all walks of life were joining in, amplifying her message, and pushing for change in their own communities. What had started as one woman's fight had become a global call to action. Cheryl's story was no longer just a story of personal triumph. It was the story of an entire movement, one that would not be silenced, one that would not be ignored. As she sat in her office, looking over the latest developments, Cheryl felt a sense of accomplishment, but she also knew there was more work to do. The fight for justice was far from over, and she would continue to lead it. The world had woken up, and Cheryl was at the forefront, leading the charge for a future that was fair, just, and equitable for all. Months had passed, and Cheryl's campaign for justice had continued to grow. Her influence was undeniable, and the movement she had started showed no signs of slowing down. What had begun as a single moment of defiance had become a rallying cry for those who had been systematically marginalized. The airline had settled the lawsuit, but that was just the beginning of the changes Cheryl was pushing for. Across industries, leaders were beginning to listen. It wasn't just about diversity or inclusion anymore, it was about true, systemic change. Cheryl had made it clear that her fight wasn't for token gestures. She wasn't looking for a few diversity training sessions and a couple of hires to meet quotas. She was calling for real accountability, real shifts in the way power operated, and the dismantling of systems that had perpetuated inequality for far too long. Her story was now embedded in the cultural consciousness. She had become a symbol of resistance, but she was more than that. She was a force for transformation. Cheryl continued to use her voice, her platform, and her influence to bring about change. She traveled the country, speaking at events and advocating for reforms in everything from education to corporate hiring practices. She was involved in grassroots organizations and worked closely with other leaders in the fight for racial justice. But even with all the attention and support she received, Cheryl remained focused on the bigger picture. She knew that true change would take time, and she wasn't willing to settle for half measures. One evening, as Cheryl sat in her office, the phone rang. It was Carla, her trusted assistant, with news that would change everything. "The airline has reached out. They want to meet," Carla said. Cheryl leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "They want to meet?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an edge of curiosity. "Yes," Carla confirmed. "They want to discuss the next steps, their plan for reform." Cheryl thought for a moment. She had never been one to seek reconciliation, but this was different. The airline had been forced into a corner, and now they were coming to her. She saw this as an opportunity not just for herself, but for the people whose voices had been silenced for so long. This was her chance to demand even more, to ensure that the changes they promised weren't just for show. Cheryl agreed to the meeting, but she made it clear that it would be on her terms. The following week, Cheryl arrived at the airline's headquarters, a place that had once been a symbol of corporate power, but now it was a place of reckoning. The executives who had once dismissed her now greeted her with a mixture of respect and fear. She could feel the weight of their recognition, but she wasn't there to make them comfortable. She was there to ensure that their words matched their actions. The room was tense as the airline executives began their presentation. They apologized again for the treatment Cheryl had received, for the systemic issues that had been allowed to fester, and for the lack of accountability. Cheryl listened carefully, her expression unreadable. She wasn't interested in their apologies. She was interested in the actions they would take moving forward. "I'm not here for empty words," Cheryl said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm here because I want to see change. Real change. I want to know how you plan to hold yourselves accountable, how you plan to ensure that no one, regardless of their race, gender, or appearance, will ever face what I faced." The executives stumbled over their words, trying to explain their plans, but Cheryl wasn't impressed by their rehearsed responses. She had seen enough corporate apologies to last a lifetime, and she wasn't interested in being placated. She wanted measurable, tangible actions. After hours of tense discussions, Cheryl finally stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "I appreciate that you're here today," she said, "but the work is far from over. The real test will be what you do after I leave this room." As she walked out of the boardroom, Cheryl knew that this was just another step in a long journey. The airline might have agreed to make changes, but Cheryl wasn't going to stop pushing. She would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for all the people who had been ignored for far too long. She would hold them accountable, and she would make sure that the changes they promised weren't just for show. As she left the building, Cheryl felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She had come a long way since that day on the plane, and she wasn't about to stop now. She knew that the battle for justice would be long, and there would be more obstacles along the way, but she was ready. Cheryl had already changed the world once, and she was determined to do it again. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The weeks following Cheryl's meeting with the airline executives were a whirlwind of public appearances, meetings with lawmakers, and continued efforts to drive systemic change. The airline had agreed to their reform plan, but Cheryl was not yet convinced that the changes they promised would be anything more than surface-level fixes. She had seen it before. Corporate apologies, flashy diversity initiatives, and empty gestures meant to pacify the public, but real change took more than words. It took sustained effort and accountability. As the pressure continued to build on the airline, Cheryl shifted her focus to other sectors. She was no longer just fighting for one company, one industry, or even one group of people. She was fighting for an entire system to be dismantled and rebuilt, one where equality, respect, and fairness were the standard, not the exception. Cheryl's advocacy had expanded beyond racial discrimination in the airline industry. She began partnering with organizations focused on criminal justice reform, equitable education, and workplace diversity. She spoke at universities, addressing future leaders and changemakers, urging them to think critically about the systems they would inherit and challenge them to make real, meaningful change. But despite her growing influence, Cheryl never allowed herself to become distracted from the heart of her mission, dismantling the systems of power that perpetuated inequality. She made it clear, time and time again, that her fight was not just for herself or even for one marginalized group. It was for everyone who had ever been denied a seat at the table. As her influence continued to spread, Cheryl faced growing resistance. Some critics, particularly those who benefited from the existing systems of power, began to push back. They claimed that her demands were too radical, that she was dividing the country, and that she was creating division where none needed to exist. But Cheryl remained unshaken. She knew that change wasn't supposed to be comfortable. It wasn't supposed to fit neatly into the existing framework. She had seen enough of the status quo to know that real progress was uncomfortable, messy, and often met with resistance. Her resolve only strengthened. As she sat at her desk one evening, reviewing notes for a speech she would give at a major political rally, Cheryl received a call from her assistant, Carla. "They're here," Carla said, referring to the high-level meeting Cheryl had scheduled with the United States Department of Justice to discuss systemic racism in corporate America. It had been months in the making, and now it was finally time to sit at the table with policymakers and decision-makers who had the power to influence the direction of future laws and regulations. Cheryl arrived at the meeting room, her heart steady, but her mind racing. She had come a long way from that flight, and now she was sitting with the very people who could bring about real, lasting change across the nation. The meeting began with pleasantries, but Cheryl wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. She wasn't there to engage in polite conversation or waste time. She was there to lay the groundwork for future policies that would prevent what had happened to her from happening to anyone else. "We are at a crossroads," Cheryl began, her voice strong and unwavering. "Corporate America has been allowed to operate unchecked for too long. Discrimination is baked into the very systems that govern these industries, and it's time we demand accountability. The room fell silent as Cheryl spoke, her words hanging in the air. She was laying the foundation for a legislative agenda that would transform corporate culture, one that would mandate transparency in hiring practices, require diversity training that actually worked, and hold companies accountable for their actions. It wasn't enough to just ask for better treatment. Cheryl was demanding a complete overhaul of the system. She spoke with clarity and purpose, never wavering from the principles that had driven her since that fateful day on the plane. This isn't just about diversity for the sake of it. This is about equity, about making sure that every single person, regardless of their background, has an equal shot at success. We need to ensure that people are not just hired for their skin color or their gender, but for their talent, their skill, and their potential. The policymakers in the room listened intently, but Cheryl could see the hesitation in their eyes. She knew that change would not come easily. It never did. But she wasn't here to negotiate for half measures. She was here to make sure that the world she was building was one where no one, regardless of their race or background, would ever have to fight for respect again. As the meeting came to a close, Cheryl stood and extended her hand. "We are not finished here," she said firmly. "This is just the beginning. We will continue to push until we see real, tangible results. And when we do, the world will know that the change started here, with people who decided that enough was enough." The room nodded in agreement, but Cheryl knew that the true work was only beginning. The next battle would be even bigger, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But she had already overcome so much, and she knew she wasn't alone. The movement she had started had grown into something far beyond her. People were standing up in ways they had never done before, demanding justice and accountability in every corner of society. She had ignited a fire, and now, that fire was burning brighter than ever. Cheryl walked out of the meeting room with the same determination she had walked into it. She wasn't just a CEO. She was a leader, a change maker, and a force that no one could ignore. As Cheryl continued to push for systemic change, the momentum of her movement spread even further, reaching into unexpected corners of the world. Her story, her courage, and her unwavering stance for justice had not only reshaped corporate America, but it had also sparked a cultural shift, one that couldn't be ignored. People from all walks of life were standing with her, sharing their own stories, and pushing for a world where equality wasn't just a distant hope, but a daily reality. In the months following the meeting with the United States Department of Justice, Cheryl began to see the fruits of her labor. New policies were being implemented in companies across the nation, thanks to the pressure she had put on lawmakers. Diversity initiatives were no longer just checkboxes on a form. They were being woven into the fabric of company cultures. Hiring practices began to change, with more companies publicly committing to equal opportunities for all candidates, regardless of their race or gender. Cheryl's fight was no longer just about the airline. It was about every industry, every system that had been complicit in perpetuating inequality. She had ignited a fire that no one could ignore, and she was determined to keep the flame alive. But the battle was far from over. The more change Cheryl pushed for, the more resistance she faced. There were those who felt threatened by the progress being made, who saw the shift in the balance of power as a challenge to their own positions of privilege. The pushback was fierce, with some prominent figures in the business world questioning the long-term viability of the reforms Cheryl was championing. They argued that the focus on diversity and inclusion was a temporary trend, one that would eventually fade once the media moved on to the next big story. But Cheryl was resolute. She knew that this wasn't a trend. This was the beginning of a new era. The resistance she faced only solidified her belief that the fight was worth it. She was not just advocating for diversity. She was fighting for the future of the country. She was fighting for a world where talent, not skin color, determined success. She was fighting for a future where no one had to prove they belonged. Cheryl's resolve was tested again when she was invited to speak at a major corporate leadership conference. The event was hosted by one of the largest business organizations in the country, and the audience was filled with influential CEOs, executives, and investors. This was her chance to speak directly to the people who had the power to make lasting change on a massive scale. But Cheryl knew this was also going to be a delicate moment. There were some in the audience who had not yet embraced the changes she was advocating for, and she would need to convince them that the future was one of inclusion, not exclusion. As she stepped onto the stage, Cheryl felt the weight of the moment. The room was filled with the country's most powerful corporate leaders, and the stakes had never been higher. But she wasn't intimidated. She had faced much more than this. "We are standing at a crossroads," Cheryl began, her voice calm but firm. "We can continue down the path we've been on, one that perpetuates inequality, one that dismisses people based on the color of their skin or their gender. Or we can choose to take a different path, one where opportunity is not determined by who you are, but by what you bring to the table." The room was silent as Cheryl's words cut through the tension. She continued, speaking not just to the executives in the room, but to everyone who was listening. "I'm here to tell you that change is possible. It's happening right now. The question is, will you be part of the solution, or will you continue to be a part of the problem?" Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Cheryl wondered if they had truly landed. But as she finished her speech, she looked out into the audience and saw something unexpected. Many of the faces were nodding in agreement. Cheryl had made her case, and the room had listened. It wasn't just that she had changed the narrative, she had transformed the room. After the speech, Cheryl was flooded with messages of support. Several CEOs approached her personally, thanking her for speaking the truth and offering their commitment to make real changes within their companies. Some even pledged to meet with Cheryl in the coming weeks to discuss how they could integrate more meaningful diversity and inclusion programs into their organizations. It was a victory, but Cheryl knew that it was only one step. There was still so much work to be done. The resistance was still there, and it would take more than a few speeches and policy changes to dismantle the deeply entrenched systems of inequality that had existed for so long. But Cheryl had become a catalyst for change. The work she had started on that plane, that day when she was humiliated and pushed aside, had grown into something far greater than she ever imagined. She was not just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for every person who had ever been marginalized, overlooked, or discriminated against. As Cheryl sat in her office later that evening, reflecting on the day's events, she realized just how far she had come. She had started as a woman seeking justice in a single, personal battle, but now she was leading a movement that would change the world. The fight for equality had many more chapters to be written, but Cheryl was determined to see it through. She had started a fire, and there was no turning back now. Her journey was just beginning, and she was ready to face whatever came next. As the months passed, Cheryl's influence only continued to grow. Her name had become a household one, synonymous not just with the airline scandal, but with a broader movement for racial justice, workplace equity, and social change. She had managed to shift the conversation from one of isolated incidents to one of systemic problems that needed addressing on a national scale. With every speech she gave, every interview she participated in, Cheryl reminded the world that real change didn't come from asking for permission, it came from demanding action. But as her influence grew, so did the challenges she faced. She was no longer just fighting for reform in one company. She was now up against the very systems that had been in place for centuries. She had become a target for some of the most powerful figures in the country who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. They tried to undermine her efforts at every turn, dismissing her as just another activist who didn't understand how business worked. But Cheryl didn't back down. She knew that progress was never easy, and that the resistance she was facing was simply a sign that she was on the right path. One day, Cheryl sat in a meeting with a group of influential corporate leaders, many of whom had once been vocal critics of her approach. The tension in the room was palpable. They had invited her to discuss potential partnerships, but Cheryl knew it was more about trying to pacify her than about any genuine desire to see change. She had seen this kind of corporate maneuvering before. "You all say you want change," Cheryl began, her voice calm but full of conviction. "But until the people at the top are willing to give up power, we won't see real progress. No one can pretend they're committed to equality when they're only willing to change at the margins." The room fell silent. Cheryl could see the discomfort on their faces as they shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They knew she was right. For too long, they had maintained their power and influence while making only the most superficial changes. "You want to be part of the solution?" Cheryl continued. "Then start by looking at the people you hire, the policies you implement, and the communities you serve. Do you have the courage to really shake things up? Or are you just trying to survive this moment until it passes?" The words hit harder than she expected. The executives in the room were not accustomed to being challenged so directly. They were used to being in control, making the decisions, and having their authority go unchallenged. But Cheryl had already proven that the old ways of doing business were no longer acceptable. She was there to change the game, not to play by the old rules. After the meeting, Cheryl felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. The battle wasn't over. The system wasn't going to change overnight, but she could already see the cracks forming. Change was coming, and it was coming because of people like her who weren't afraid to speak up, even when the voices around them were deafeningly silent. Cheryl's journey was far from complete. There were still too many people who were being left behind, too many communities that hadn't yet found their voice. She knew that as long as there were people still fighting for the basic right to be seen and heard, her work was not done. But she also knew that the fight had grown beyond one individual. It was no longer just about Cheryl and her story, it was about a collective effort, a movement of people who had united under a single, powerful message: equality for all. Cheryl continued to travel the country, speaking at rallies, meeting with grassroots organizations, and pushing for policy changes at every level. She had become a force that no one could ignore, and she was determined to keep pushing until every system of power was accountable. As she looked back on everything she had achieved, Cheryl couldn't help but feel proud of the work she had done. But she also knew that the work wasn't over. She had sparked something powerful, something that could not be undone, and she was ready to continue the fight. The world had been forced to look at itself in a new light, to examine its biases and flaws. But Cheryl knew that real progress would come when people no longer had to fight for their right to belong. She had started a movement, and that movement would continue until everyone, no matter their race, gender, or background, was given the respect and opportunity they deserved. Cheryl's resolve was unshaken. She wasn't done. The fight for justice was just beginning, and she was ready to lead it, no matter where it took her. As Cheryl continued to push for change, the impact of her movement reached new heights. She had started a fire that was impossible to put out, and it was now spreading across industries, communities, and even political spheres. What had begun as a personal fight for justice had become a global campaign that demanded attention, action, and accountability. Cheryl's name was now known in boardrooms, in classrooms, in newsrooms, and across social media. She had become the face of a generation's struggle for equality, a symbol of resistance to systems that had long overlooked the rights of marginalized people. Despite the victories, Cheryl remained acutely aware that there was still so much work to be done. The fight for equality was not something that could be won in a single battle. It was a long, ongoing struggle that would require perseverance, vigilance, and, most importantly, unity. Cheryl knew that her influence had reached a critical point, but she also knew that the powers she was up against weren't going to give up easily. She continued to face criticism from those who were invested in keeping the status quo intact. Some of the most powerful voices in the business world questioned her methods, claiming that her approach was too radical, too divisive. But Cheryl wasn't interested in appeasing those who sought to maintain the existing systems of power. She had spent her entire life watching people who looked like her be silenced, ignored, and erased. She wasn't going to let that happen anymore, not for herself and not for anyone else. Her mission was clear: to create a world where every person, regardless of their race, gender, or background, could thrive without being held back by prejudice and discrimination. Cheryl's efforts extended beyond the corporate world and into the halls of government. She became an advocate for policy changes that would hold companies accountable for their practices. She worked tirelessly with lawmakers to draft bills that would enforce transparency in hiring, eliminate discriminatory pay gaps, and ensure that companies who received government contracts upheld the highest standards of diversity and inclusion. She was no longer just a business leader, she was a change agent, a voice for the voiceless, and an advocate for the voiceless. It wasn't long before Cheryl found herself invited to speak in front of lawmakers on Capitol Hill, addressing an audience of influential figures who had the power to enact the changes she had long fought for. The moment was monumental. It was a chance to directly influence the policies that would affect the future of every marginalized person in the country. When she walked into the hearing room, Cheryl was met with the familiar stares of scrutiny, but this time, there was something different in the air. The world was watching. She had become a force that couldn't be ignored. The hearing began with a series of questions from senators who had invited Cheryl to speak. Some were supportive, while others were more skeptical, questioning whether her efforts were creating unnecessary division. But Cheryl, as she always had, remained composed. She spoke not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been denied opportunity because of the color of their skin or the shape of their name. "I stand here today," Cheryl began, her voice strong and unwavering, "because I am tired of seeing people be told that they are not enough simply because of the color of their skin. I am here because I believe in a world where talent is recognized for what it is, not for what it's wrapped in." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The world is changing, and I want to make sure that no one gets left behind. We need policies that not only encourage diversity, but require it. We need accountability, not just for the sake of the companies involved, but for the sake of everyone who has been kept out." Her words struck a chord. The senators in the room, who had once viewed her as a controversial figure, were now listening to her with a new sense of respect. Cheryl wasn't just talking about numbers or percentages. She was talking about people, about real lives, and about the future of an entire nation. By the end of the hearing, Cheryl had done what she always did. She had shifted the conversation. She had made it clear that the time for half measures was over, that the world was watching, and that action was no longer optional. The lawmakers, though still divided in their views, were forced to reckon with the weight of her message. Cheryl left the room that day knowing that the battle had just taken a significant step forward. But she also knew that real change would require more than just speeches and meetings. It would require the continued efforts of millions of people who believed in the cause, who were willing to put in the work to bring about the world they wanted to see. As Cheryl drove back to her office after the hearing, she reflected on the journey she had been on. She had started as a woman who had been humiliated on a plane, and now she was speaking in front of the nation's most powerful lawmakers, pushing for a future where no one would ever have to face the kind of injustice she had. It had been a long road, but Cheryl was far from done. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready for it. The fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint, and she was committed to seeing it through to the end. Cheryl had started a movement, and it was gaining momentum every day. She knew that no matter how difficult the fight, no matter how much resistance she faced, she had the power to change the world. And she wasn't going to stop until she had made that world a better place for everyone. As Cheryl's campaign for justice continued to gain momentum, her life began to take on a rhythm that balanced the heavy demands of leadership with moments of reflection and personal growth. The weight of the responsibility she carried was not lost on her, but neither was the importance of the work she was doing. Every speech she gave, every policy she helped implement, and every movement she made in the public eye served to further cement her place in history as one of the most influential change agents of her time. Yet, Cheryl never lost sight of the reason she had started this journey in the first place. The fight wasn't about recognition. It was about creating a lasting impact. It was about ensuring that the future would be a place where every individual, regardless of race, background, or gender, would have equal opportunities to succeed. As Cheryl continued her work, she found herself invited to even more significant platforms, ones that she had once only dreamed of. Her name was synonymous with progress and change, and as she addressed crowds of thousands, she realized that the movement she had ignited had become something far greater than herself. But even with all of the victories and triumphs, Cheryl knew that the fight was ongoing. Change was not linear, and there would be many more battles to fight. She faced constant resistance from those who believed that the systems in place were fine just as they were, from those who feared that the progress being made would upend their own power and privilege. But Cheryl was not deterred. She had seen too much to back down now. She had experienced firsthand the consequences of ignoring injustice, and she was committed to making sure that no one would ever feel powerless in the face of systemic bias again. Cheryl's resolve was tested again when she was asked to lead a nationwide task force aimed at tackling systemic racism in higher education. It was an enormous challenge, one that would require sweeping changes at every level of the education system. Cheryl knew that access to quality education was one of the most significant factors in achieving long-term social mobility, and she was determined to make sure that racial disparities were addressed head-on. Her work with the task force was pivotal. She spearheaded initiatives to increase diversity in university admissions, worked to eliminate discriminatory practices in financial aid distribution, and advocated for curriculum changes that would include the stories and perspectives of marginalized communities. But while Cheryl poured her heart and soul into the work, she also faced intense scrutiny. Some critics claimed that her approach was too radical, while others questioned whether the changes she was pushing for would lead to a genuine shift in the way higher education operated. There were even those who tried to undermine her efforts by distorting her message, attempting to frame her as someone who wanted to tear down institutions rather than reform them. But Cheryl stood firm, as she always had. She knew that true progress required difficult conversations, uncomfortable actions, and the willingness to dismantle systems that had long been unjust. Her efforts weren't about destruction, they were about rebuilding a system that could serve everyone equally. It wasn't easy. There were countless setbacks, delays, and obstacles along the way. But Cheryl kept pushing forward, reminding herself that every step was a step closer to the future she envisioned. The task force eventually implemented new guidelines for universities, creating standards that not only ensured equitable access to higher education, but also emphasized the importance of creating inclusive environments for students from all backgrounds. It was a hard-fought victory, but it was one that Cheryl knew would have a ripple effect for generations to come. Yet, despite all the progress, Cheryl continued to be met with resistance, particularly from the most entrenched members of society who had benefited from the status quo. Some leaders attempted to discredit her work, to twist her words and undermine her efforts. They accused her of being too focused on race, of creating division where none existed. But Cheryl remained resolute. She understood that those who had the most to lose were always the loudest in their opposition. She had seen this before, and she knew that the best way to prove her critics wrong was to keep pushing forward, to keep proving that the changes she fought for weren't just necessary, they were long overdue. As the years passed, Cheryl's legacy began to take shape. Her name was synonymous with justice and equality, and her influence extended far beyond the corporate world, beyond the halls of academia, and even beyond the borders of the United States. She had become a global advocate for racial justice, speaking at international conferences, advising world leaders, and partnering with global organizations to create a more equitable future. But despite the accolades and the recognition, Cheryl never lost sight of the fact that the work was far from finished. There were still countless communities that faced discrimination on a daily basis, still too many systems that perpetuated inequality without consequence. Cheryl's fight had only just begun, but as she stood before an audience of thousands at an international summit on racial equality, Cheryl realized how far she had come. She had started as one woman who had been humiliated in a moment of injustice, but now she was leading a global movement that had the potential to change the world. She knew that her efforts would leave a lasting mark on history, but more than that, she knew that she had started a fire that no one would be able to extinguish. The future was uncertain, and there would always be more battles to fight. But Cheryl had already proven that when you stand up for what's right, when you fight for justice, you can change the world. And that was exactly what she had done. As Cheryl's journey continued, she found herself at a crossroads once again. The movement she had started had gained unprecedented momentum, and the changes she had fought for were taking root in places she had never imagined. Yet, even with all the progress, she knew that the path ahead would not be easy. She had seen the power of resistance from those who feared change, and she understood that the battle for equality was ongoing. One morning, as Cheryl sat at her desk, reviewing the latest reports on the progress of the policies she had helped implement, she received a call that would alter the course of her mission. It was from one of her trusted allies in Congress. "Cheryl, we need you to speak at the upcoming Senate hearing on the future of racial equity laws," her friend said. "This is a critical moment. The laws you've been working on, they need a champion in the Senate. And right now it looks like there's a real chance to push them through." Cheryl felt a sense of responsibility wash over her. She had been in this position before, standing up for what she believed in, but this time it felt different. The stakes were higher. This wasn't just about one company or one industry anymore. This was about reshaping the very fabric of society, ensuring that the laws of the land would reflect the values of justice, fairness, and equality for all. She agreed to speak at the hearing, and as the day drew near, the pressure built. The room would be filled with lawmakers, lobbyists, and activists. She knew that the opposing side would be vocal, attempting to twist the conversation to their advantage, casting doubt on the necessity of the policies she was pushing for. But Cheryl had faced resistance before. She had faced it on the plane when she was humiliated, and she had faced it from the most powerful people in corporate America. She had learned to use that resistance as fuel, to turn it into determination. The day of the Senate hearing arrived, and Cheryl walked into the chamber with the same calm confidence she had always exuded. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. Lawmakers were preparing to argue their positions, and the debate promised to be fierce. Cheryl took her seat at the witness table, her eyes scanning the room. As she looked around, she saw both allies and opponents. The work she had done had made her a polarizing figure, and she knew that not everyone was on her side. But that didn't matter. She was here for one reason: to make sure that the laws being debated would serve the people, not the powerful interests that had held sway for far too long. The session began with a series of opening statements from both sides. Cheryl listened carefully, her mind sharp, as each senator spoke. The opposition argued that the proposed laws would disrupt the economy, that they would impose undue burdens on businesses, and that the laws were unnecessary, given the progress that had already been made. But Cheryl wasn't there to engage in empty debates. She had come to make a statement that the time for excuses was over, and that true equality could not be sacrificed for the sake of comfort or convenience. When it was her turn to speak, Cheryl stood up, her voice steady and unwavering. "I am here today because we are at a crossroads," she began, her words filling the room. "The policies we debate today will shape the future of this country. The question is, will we continue to let the systems of power that have kept some people at the top and others at the bottom remain in place? Or will we finally make the decision to tear down the structures that have perpetuated inequality for generations?" Her words rang out with force, and she could see that the room was listening. She continued, her voice growing even stronger. "I am not here to ask for change. I am here to demand it. I am here to make sure that every person, no matter their race, gender, or background, has a fair shot at success. That means passing laws that hold companies accountable for their discriminatory practices, that ensure equal pay for equal work, and that give everyone the chance to thrive without being held back by bias." Cheryl paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I am not asking for charity. I am asking for justice. And justice is long overdue." The room was silent for a moment. Cheryl could feel the weight of the moment, but she didn't flinch. She had prepared for this, and she knew that this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. The debate continued, but Cheryl's words had set the tone. The resistance, while still present, had begun to lose some of its strength. Senators who had initially been skeptical of her proposals now found themselves questioning their own positions. Cheryl had planted the seed of doubt in their minds, and that was all she needed to do. As the hearing came to a close, Cheryl sat back in her seat, feeling the energy in the room shift. She had said what needed to be said. Now, it was up to the lawmakers to decide whether they would listen. As the session adjourned and Cheryl walked out of the chamber, she felt a deep sense of pride. She had faced down the opposition and made her case, and no matter what happened next, she knew that the fight for justice would continue. The road ahead was still long, but Cheryl had proven that one voice, when wielded with purpose and determination, could change the course of history. As the weeks went by, Cheryl's influence continued to expand, and her movement gained even more traction across the country. The hearing on racial equity had marked a turning point, but Cheryl knew that it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. While the debate on Capitol Hill was important, the true battle for change was fought in the hearts and minds of the people. It was about getting everyday individuals to see the injustice that so many had been living with for years, and to make them understand that it was not enough to simply be passive observers. Cheryl's efforts were beginning to shift the cultural conversation about race and equality, but there was still resistance. Some communities, some industries, some people, particularly those with the most power, refused to acknowledge that change was necessary. Cheryl had come to expect this. She had seen it throughout her life. Change was never easy, and it was always met with pushback. But that only made her more determined. She knew that the fight would be long, but she was willing to fight for the long haul. Over the next few months, Cheryl continued to speak at rallies, town halls, and community meetings. She traveled to cities and towns across the country, sharing her message with anyone who would listen. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life, students, workers, families, and even corporate leaders reached out to express their support. They wanted to know how they could be a part of the solution, how they could help create a more equitable society. Cheryl had always been clear that this was not just her fight, it was a collective effort. She had sparked the conversation, but it was the people who would carry the torch forward. She spent time mentoring young leaders, helping to guide and inspire them to keep pushing for the changes they wanted to see in their communities. She had become not just a symbol of resistance, but a teacher, a guide, and a champion for those who felt powerless. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed, and soon, the political and corporate world began to realize that Cheryl's influence wasn't just a passing moment. It was a movement, and it was here to stay. It was clear that Cheryl had become a central figure in the national conversation about race and equality. However, not everyone was on board. Some of the most influential corporate leaders, those who held the keys to the systems Cheryl was trying to dismantle, were determined to stop her. They understood the power of the change she was pushing for, and they feared what would happen if it gained full momentum. They had a lot to lose. So, they began to fight back. They worked to discredit her, using their media connections and resources to undermine her credibility. They spread misinformation about her motives, twisted her words, and attacked her character. But Cheryl didn't let the attacks distract her. She had been in this position before fighting against an establishment that wanted to maintain the status quo. She had faced much worse. Every time they tried to tear her down, she used their attacks as fuel to push harder. Cheryl had a larger mission, and nothing could stop her now. One of the most powerful moments of Cheryl's journey came when she was invited to speak at a global summit on racial justice and economic equality. Leaders from all over the world gathered to discuss the future of racial equity in the 21st century. It was an event that would be covered by the world's media, and Cheryl knew it was an opportunity to speak directly to the global stage. As she stood in front of the thousands of delegates, journalists, and activists, Cheryl was not intimidated. She knew the stakes were higher than ever. The summit would set the tone for future global policies, and she was determined to make sure that the voices of the marginalized were heard. "We are at a turning point," Cheryl began, her voice clear and resolute. "For too long, we have ignored the injustices that have plagued our societies. We've allowed systems of oppression to persist unchecked, believing that change would come on its own. But now, we have the opportunity to do something that will create a better world for future generations." Cheryl paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle in. She could feel the weight of the room's attention. This is not about charity. This is not about token gestures or empty promises. This is about creating a world where justice is not a privilege, but a right for everyone. Where race, gender, or background do not determine whether you succeed or fail. This is about creating an equitable future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. Her words echoed throughout the room, and the crowd erupted into applause. It was clear that Cheryl had made her mark. She had reminded the world that the fight for equality was not just a matter of policy, it was a matter of human dignity. By the time the summit ended, Cheryl had solidified her place as one of the most influential leaders in the global movement for racial justice. She had proven that, no matter the obstacles, no matter the pushback, she would continue to fight. Her work wasn't done. There was still more to be done in the United States, and now there was more work to be done globally. Cheryl's journey had taken her to places she never imagined, and it had turned her into a symbol of change. But more importantly, it had turned her into a force that no one could ignore. As she stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, Cheryl knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was a lifelong commitment, and she was prepared to lead it, no matter where it took her. As Cheryl's influence continued to grow, so did the scope of her mission. The victories she had achieved so far were monumental, but she knew that true, lasting change required constant vigilance, and the road ahead would still be full of obstacles. The more momentum her movement gained, the more resistance she faced from those who had the most to lose. She knew that some of the most powerful people in the world were actively working to undo the progress she had made, but Cheryl wasn't deterred. She had spent her entire life breaking barriers, and she knew that the only way to create lasting transformation was to keep pushing forward, no matter the opposition. One evening, after a long day of meetings with lawmakers and corporate leaders, Cheryl sat alone in her office, reflecting on the path she had walked. It had been years since that moment on the plane when she had been humiliated, and in that time, she had become a symbol of resistance, a force of nature that could not be ignored. But the weight of the journey was beginning to take its toll. The pressure to continue to lead, to continue to fight, sometimes felt overwhelming. Yet, she also knew that her fight was bigger than herself. It was bigger than any single person or even any single issue. She was part of a movement that was reshaping society at its core, and every day that she fought, she was making the world a little bit better for the generations that would follow. Cheryl was well aware that the battles ahead would be just as difficult as the ones she had already won, but she also understood the power of her position. She had the ear of lawmakers, the support of millions, and the ability to influence some of the most powerful institutions in the world. But it was never about power, it was always about making sure that the world worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. The following week, Cheryl was invited to give the keynote speech at an international conference on global justice and human rights. The event was being held in a grand hall in New York City, and the audience would include world leaders, international corporations, and non-governmental organizations. Cheryl knew that this speech would be another moment to shift the narrative, to remind the world that the fight for equality had to be fought on a global scale. When she stepped onto the stage, she was met with a sea of faces. For a brief moment, the enormity of the audience hit her, but she quickly shook it off. She had been in far more intimidating situations, and this was no different. She wasn't there for applause. She wasn't there for accolades. She was there to make sure that the message she carried would be heard by those who had the power to create real, lasting change. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cheryl began, her voice echoing in the hall, "we are standing at a critical juncture in history. The world is watching us, and the decisions we make today will affect the future of our children, our grandchildren, and generations yet unborn. We are in a moment of reckoning, and it is time that we face the truth. We have built a system of power that works for only a few, while leaving the rest behind." Cheryl paused, allowing her words to resonate with the audience. But this is not just about the past. It is about the future. We can choose to continue on the path of inequality, or we can choose to create a world where every person, regardless of their race, their gender, their background, or their identity, has the chance to succeed. A world where every person is seen for who they are, not for what others think they should be. The room was silent as Cheryl's words sank in. She wasn't speaking to politicians or corporations, she was speaking to the people who held the future in their hands. This is a global issue. It's not enough to focus on just one country or one community. We need international cooperation to build policies that ensure racial equity and social justice are a priority everywhere. Every government, every corporation, every institution needs to hold themselves accountable for their role in perpetuating inequality. We need to create systems that uplift, rather than tear down. Cheryl's voice grew stronger, more determined. We can no longer afford to ignore the voices of those who have been silenced. We can no longer turn a blind eye to the injustice that continues to plague our societies. We have a responsibility and obligation to make sure that no one is left behind. We have a responsibility to fight for a future where equality is the norm, not the exception. The crowd erupted into applause, but Cheryl wasn't done. She wasn't there for the applause. She was there to make sure that her message didn't just end in that room. It had to reach beyond the walls of that conference, beyond the corridors of power, and into the communities where change was most needed. As she left the stage, Cheryl knew that the speech would have an impact. It wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the people who would take those words and put them into action. The movement she had started wasn't just a wave that would crash and fade. It was a force that would continue to build, gaining strength with every challenge, every victory, and every person who decided to stand up for what was right. She wasn't done yet. There was still so much to be done, and Cheryl was ready for whatever came next. As Cheryl's message spread across the globe, she was met with a tidal wave of support, but also a mounting resistance. Her words, her actions, and her relentless pursuit of justice had stirred a deep reckoning, and the more she pushed for systemic change, the more powerful the forces working against her became. She had made incredible strides in her efforts to dismantle the barriers of inequality, but now the real test began. The system had begun to fight back in ways she had not anticipated. It wasn't just the corporate world anymore, it was government institutions, influential political figures, and the media. They had tried to discredit her, to label her as a disruptor rather than a leader. But Cheryl had always known this was part of the battle. She had anticipated the pushback because it was the same resistance that had fought every significant change in history. The road to progress was never easy. Cheryl was in a meeting late one evening with her closest advisors, discussing the growing opposition. "We've been making incredible strides, but we can't ignore the fact that the fight is intensifying," Carla, her trusted assistant, said as she passed Cheryl the latest report. There are corporate lobbyists pushing back hard against the changes we've proposed, and some lawmakers are beginning to question their support. Cheryl listened carefully, her mind working through the details. She knew this day would come, and she was prepared for it. She wasn't about to let a few powerful figures derail the progress that had been made. "We've reached a tipping point," Cheryl said, her voice steady but with a sense of urgency. "It's time to escalate. We can't back down now." Her words were not just a call to action, they were a reminder to everyone in the room of what was at stake. They weren't fighting for small reforms anymore. They were fighting for a complete overhaul of systems that had been designed to keep people like Cheryl from ever reaching the table. The next day, Cheryl took to social media, making a bold statement about the resistance she was facing. She wasn't going to let her efforts be undermined by a few who had always benefited from the status quo. She used her platform to call for a global coalition, urging people to join the fight for racial justice, equality, and economic opportunity. "We are at a crossroads," she wrote in her post. "The powers that be will try to silence us, but we will not be silenced. This movement isn't just mine, it's ours. We will fight, not just for today, but for the future of our children, our grandchildren, and generations yet unborn. We are stronger than they think, and we will never stop until justice is achieved." The post went viral, reaching millions of people around the world. The response was overwhelming. People rallied behind her, not just with words, but with action. Protests erupted in cities across the globe, from New York to London, from Los Angeles to Johannesburg. Cheryl's movement had ignited a spark that no one could put out. The resistance was fierce, but Cheryl knew that the momentum was on their side. She wasn't alone. The people who had been fighting alongside her were growing stronger every day. As the weeks went by, Cheryl's presence in the media and in political circles became more prominent. She was invited to speak at rallies, in boardrooms, and even at international summits. But as much as she appreciated the support, she knew that the real work was being done on the ground. The grassroots efforts, the communities organizing for change, were what would sustain the movement. She made it her mission to elevate those voices, to make sure that the people who had been fighting for change before her were never forgotten. Cheryl's role was to amplify the message and provide the resources necessary to make real, lasting change. She knew that this fight was far from over. The system was fighting back harder than ever, but with every victory, with every new voice that joined the cause, Cheryl felt the weight of history behind her. The world was changing, and she was part of that change. Her efforts had already made a lasting impact, but she wasn't done yet. She had started a revolution, and she would lead it to the end, no matter the cost. The final chapter of Cheryl's journey unfolded in ways she never could have imagined when she first began her fight for justice. What started as a personal battle to reclaim her dignity had become a global movement, one that challenged not just the structures of corporate power, but the very foundations of societal inequality. Cheryl's influence had reached the highest echelons of power, and her voice had become one of the most powerful in the world. But despite the unprecedented progress, Cheryl knew that the work was far from finished. Every victory only highlighted how much more needed to be done, how many systems were still entrenched in oppression, and how many people were still being left behind. Yet, for the first time in her life, she felt a profound sense of peace. She had fought the fight for the right reasons, and she had won not just for herself, but for an entire generation, for those who had been silenced for too long. The fight for justice had become a movement, one that transcended any single individual, and instead embodied the collective efforts of millions of voices. As Cheryl walked through the streets of Washington, D.C., after her final speech before Congress on the implementation of national racial equity laws, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The streets were filled with people who had come from all corners of the country to show their support. It was a beautiful sight, but Cheryl knew that the true impact was in the hearts and minds of the individuals who had been awakened by this fight. In that moment, she realized that the revolution she had sparked would continue to grow, long after she had moved on to the next chapter of her life. She had set the wheels in motion, and now it was up to the next generation to carry the torch forward. Her work would never be fully done, but the foundation she had built would stand firm. And as she looked around, seeing people of every race, every background, and every walk of life standing together, Cheryl felt a quiet satisfaction. The system had been shaken to its core, and though it was still being rebuilt, it was being rebuilt with fairness, justice, and equality at its center. Her heart swelled with pride as she reflected on the faces in the crowd, knowing that the world they would inherit would be far more equitable than the one she had known. The movement she had started was not just a fight against the corporate powers that had held so much sway for so long. It was a fight for human dignity, for the inherent right of every individual to be treated with respect and fairness. Cheryl had become a beacon of hope, not just for her generation, but for generations to come. As she stood in the middle of that sea of supporters, Cheryl knew that the work wasn't over, but she also knew that her place in history was secure. She had played her part. She had fought, she had led, and she had won. The world was different because of her, and she could finally walk away, knowing that she had given everything she had to a cause that was greater than herself. The movement she had ignited would continue to grow, and while Cheryl would continue to be a guiding force from the sidelines, it was clear that the power had shifted. Change was no longer a distant dream, it was a reality in the making. And as Cheryl looked toward the horizon, she knew that the future was bright. The fight was not over, but the world was on the right path, and she had helped lead it there.